You're watching a Decentered Media Talk with me, Rob Watson. Conversations about community media. Visit decentered.co.uk or follow on Instagram and Twitter at Decentered Media. Hello, Rob Watson here, and this is a Decentered Media Talk. This is number 8 in our series of Introduction to Community Media, and today what I want to talk about is the idea of using media as a platform for self-expression. So what I'm going to do, as ever, is touch upon some general topics. There's an awful lot that we can follow up with and from through these conversations, and think about where community media, as we've identified previously, is part of a developmental process for social change, and that thinking about where we are situated, if you like, both socially and as groups, but also as individuals, as people engaged in a process of collaborative social learning, conversation, discussion, and deliberation. So I want to run through some examples and some ideas of how we might best facilitate this and what it is we get out of it, and where we might look for this to go in the future. As ever, there's going to be a set of notes that are posted with this video, and if you've got any comments or feedback, if you're using the forum, then please leave a message there, and otherwise email and Twitter are the kind of the usual addresses. So let me start by sharing our screen, and if we are thinking about the nature of our self-expression, then what I want to kind of work through is what this means in practice, because it's fine. You know, I'm a pragmatist, and it's fine to talk about things in theory, but we should always remember that we need to ask the question, how is this implemented in practice, and what do we learn from that relationship between theory and practice? So I don't ever see these things as being something which are identifiable purely on their own. They should work this way or they should work that way. Let's be guided by the challenges of implementing something and sustaining something, because that's what we really need to get into to change the way that things function and work, rather than just looking at the outcomes and the effects. We can wishfully want to achieve these aims and outcomes, and as important as whatever aims and outcomes we identify, we believe them to be, but we really also need to be thinking about, well, what is going to make this work in practice? So one of the challenges, I think, with community media is that a big role for community media, and an essential role that's seems to be something that here in the UK we're in a bit of a rut with at the moment, is the representation of people who are otherwise overlooked, whether that's through marginalisation, through disadvantage, through stigmatisation, literally repressive activities within a society or a community, and what does community media do, and its other forms of alternative DIY media? What does it enable us to do that, one, provides an outlet for people who are otherwise overlooked and ignored, or for people who are marginalised and who don't have a voice in the way that our social engagement and deliberation and conversations maybe should take place, or who don't have the ability to manifest and own their own sense of identity. But often we live in a world where our sense of identity is given to us, it's placed upon us, and it's something which is controlled by other people. And I think one of the things we've got to think about is how are we reaching people with our media who are on the very edges and margins of society? And I think the idea, we see this at the moment with the implementation of the new layer of digital broadcast and SSDAB, that there is a kind of a regard in government and the regulator Ofcom that it's a platform, it's a system that has these amazing benefits and results. But if you're living on the streets and your access to information is limited, and maybe your literacy skills are limited, then how on earth can you listen to local radio or national radio on a DAB receiver, which eats batteries, quite expensive, not very portable? What's going on in terms of thinking about the systems that we need to keep and maintain in place that enable those people who are the least able and who have the least social support to still maintain and play a role within our communities and our society. So there's a kind of, often there's a way of defining alternative media which is based around the models of political alternative media, and I'm not arguing that the networks of alternative independent media are not valid. They are valid, and but I think sometimes, as in anything, a one-sided approach is not very productive. But if you want to get a good sample, and it's a couple of years old now, but I think it's still, when I was reviewing this, I was looking at it to see what the kind of platforms are of excuse me, of alternative media and the range of forms of alternative media. There's a really good website called Flying Fish, which is worth having a look at, and they've got a load of links to different places, different projects that promote a sense of alternative media. But the danger, I think, sometimes is that these kind of approaches can be a bit theoretical. So, if I expressed it quite crudely, it's often about a certain kind of politics that wants to change an ideology and doesn't necessarily get into the functional aspects of changing the resources that people have access to. So whilst reforming international capitalism and the consumer society and addressing the inequities of globalization are essential, I think one of the things I think we should use as our yardstick for our success is the pragmatic adage, what's the difference that makes the difference? And where do we make a difference? If we're coming together to talk about policy change and social change on the basis of what feels good in a meeting or what feels good in a policy forum, we're not looking at this from the right end of the tube, if you like. We need to be looking at this at the point where it makes most impact and it has most effect. So there's a kind of discussion that's to be had about the definition of alternative media and its role in terms of the theory that supports it, the methodology that is it's practiced by, but also the kind of frame of reference about how it's evaluated and the kind of processes that are highlighted in this way. And kind of the languages of alternative media, there's often a crossover, and this is a generational thing as well, which is well worth exploring and trying to get a sense of. Is I come from a generation that my popular culture was established in the 1970s and 80s, for good or ill. But what makes something alternative media? What makes something radical media? And what makes something popular culture? And sometimes there's a kind of crossover, and you get a sense that maintaining a an awareness of those things that are within our popular culture, the zeitgeist as it's described, means that you kind of track where things are going and where things are changing, because they do indicate certain levels of change, both positive and negative. Excuse me. So it's, kind of our evaluation of media kind of has to be, we have to take into account the benefits of mass media. And I know I've talked critically and often do speak critically of what I see are the negative aspects of of mass media, as opposed to, mass media bad, community media good. Well, it's not as simple as that. It's, if it was as simple as that, then, we'd have easy answers and we'd all be getting on and we wouldn't have any problems to think about. Taking a bit more of a holistic and integrated approach, where we recognize that there are things about mass media that are incredibly valuable and incredibly meaningful. And there are things about community media or alternative media and local media which are incredibly negative and incredibly destructive. So it's kind of, where do we find the balance? And sometimes I think there's too much of a focus, in my view, on either like audiences and commercial advertising, and kind of an expression of what is the mainstream. And sometimes there's too much of a kind of, it's easy to sit in your niche and never come out of that, your little hovel, and say, no, I'm happy in my hovel and I'm not going to come out to meet anybody else in the mainstream. And it's, having a one-sided approach is probably not a good idea. But we have to learn that through practice. I think we have to learn that through giving it a go. But it is in our culture. This is a clip from the BBC's history of pop, the episode 3, I think, which is the tribal gatherings, and it kind of indicates how much things have changed, but also what the roots are of some of the expressions of alternative and popular culture, and how that kind of edge of youthful exuberance can point us in a direction which is hopefully transformational in a positive sense, and if not transformational, then maybe oppositional. And where do we fit with these things, and what happens when we get a bit older, and does nostalgia take over, or is it a kind of call to, when we see these things now, is it like a call to arms?
Clash, clash, clash!
Pop music is the thing we've used to tell everyone what we believe in and who we are. This is its story, told by those who love it the most. The fans. Fans from all over the country have been digging out and sharing with us some of their most treasured, rare and personal memorabilia. A video of a first gig, a special ticket, a teenage diary, all precious and all with a wonderful story.
Look at this girl with her hair flying and people with their fab clothes. It wasn't just about good dancers, it was about fashionable people.
There were rich kids, there were poor kids, there were black kids, there were white kids, there was everything in between.
And there was a truck outside on which naked men were playing rock music. And I thought, well, this is different,
So, whether you're a fan of indie or acid house, northern soul or hip-hop, punk, prog or blue beat, this is about us, the people at the very heart of this thing called pop. Tonight we're in a time when Britain was restless and angry, when music got involved in passionate protest, and the high street filled with colourful factions of music lovers.
It says, off to Blitz Embassy Club, December 9th, 1981. Approved by Steve Strange.
Everyone was forming bands then, and we made a band. He couldn't sing, I couldn't play bass.
Mods would never go to grassroots. No. You would just be murdered.
It's the decade I became part of it all by singing in my own band, The Selector. So let's talk about how we got lost in music, how we showed off our style, how we chose our musical tribes.
So that really kind of great energy that goes with youth culture and pop culture, if you like, is one of the defining features of post-modernity, the period that comes after the Second World War, which brought about a kind of the rise of the teenager, the rise of mass media, consumer culture, fashion became democratized, bands like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, and just kind of broke boundaries, really. And we saw this kind of vibrancy that came through and a creative energy that came through. But it was something that people were in part of. It wasn't a culture that was done to people. It wasn't a culture that people had to acquire by serving time. So, as a teenager, as a youth, typically you didn't have a culture of your own. You didn't have a sense of identity based around your age. You were just you went from being a child to an adult, but you were expected to acquire the attributes of your host culture. Whereas this was like a choice. You could participate in this culture. And there was an interest and exchange that you met other people who made a willful engagement with that culture. So you formed a band, or you went to a club, or you went to particular concerts, or you bought sorts of magazines. And you bought into this sense of cultures. And this is what generates a sense of community. So there's a sense of identification, communities of identity based around the type of music that you liked. And it's difficult now to express to people that, music was often clearly segregated, is that you are either into the Beatles or the Rolling Stones, but not both. You are either a mod or a rocker, but not both. You are either a glam rocker or a hippie, and not both. And there was this kind of polarization that people were kind of pushed into or willfully adopted, which now subsequently, I think, for the post-millennial generations, it's now just everything's a click away from a download or a video that you can watch. And those kind of cultural identifications, people are very eclectic now, very, very much an overview of all sorts of types of music, and don't dogmatically sit on one side of the fence. People are a bit more people now still retain those identities and go to conventions like punk and mod conventions, but it's not seen as something necessarily worth getting into a fight about, which maybe when you were younger was part of the frisson of energy, was also had a violent side to it as well. So it brought people together, but it also divided people. So it's this idea that, when people come face to face and choose to associate with particular markers of identity, that's kind of where a powerful motivation for a participatory community. And our community media is something which we use both to facilitate participation in its general sense and in its more radical sense, but it's also something which is about kind of the kind of content that we go on to produce. So participation has evolved as the technology has evolved to being not just something that you consume and maybe wear the right kind of clothes and go to the right kind of club, but also about the kind of media that you create and who you create that with. So you kind of now also become identified with the participation in the platform. So you become a podcaster, or you become a vlogger, or you become an influencer based on the nature that you are also participating in the process of developing content, as well as thinking about what that content is about. And maybe to some extent that might have gone a bit too far. And it's become, in some examples, it becomes content less. So it's all very well being able to make proficient YouTube videos, but if they say nothing, what's the point in doing it? What's the message? What's the idea that's being expressed behind the content that you produce? Rather than simply thinking, well, I'm really good at producing photographs or videos or whatever it is, but what have you got to say? And I think that's the mirror that is helps us to reflect on what it is that we're doing. When it's great fun adopting a new form of media technology to play with. It's a fantastic idea. But what have we got to say? What's our point of view? What's our contribution to the discussion? So this idea of participatory engagement is kind of tells us a lot about how and what kind of society we are. And are we just regurgitating things? Are we imitators? Or do we have something within what we want to say which is a genuine expression of ourselves? And that's a very difficult thing to nurture. It's also very fragile, and it's very easy to crowd out people's voices in the unique, authentic voice, that genuine voice that people have is fragile. Very, very. That's why most people stick to groups, because you kind of find solace in group identity rather than individual. To have a strong individual voice is incredibly unusual, and it's often maybe only retrospectively that people can see that there was a voice that was being expressed there. I think I saw a quote from David Bowie the other day, where he's quoted as saying, being at the edge of what you're comfortable with makes you uncomfortable. He said, but that's how that you're moving forward. Whereas I suppose. In my own practice, this is very much the case, kind of sticking with what we know and how do we move forward into the unknown is quite a challenge. And as individuals, we might not be able to do that. As groups, we might be able to do that to a larger extent, but also the group can be confining. So there's a lot, excuse me, for some reason I've got a dry throat. Let's have a sip of my coffee. Maybe it's the coffee that's causing the dry throat. Anyway, so this kind of idea is about representation in our media, and there's a phrase which is, the hypernormalization of our sense of identity that we get from and through our media, which is not us. It's somehow, this is the kind of postmodern dilemma, which is the image of us is created within the media environment. And we can go with that. We can go with the flow of that. And it has great benefits, but is that us as individuals? Is that who we are? Is that our contribution and our expression of who we are? And one of the things I like to remind people about community media, in whatever format, we're always concerned with people finding their voice, and that's a good powerful thing to think about. What is our voice? Where does our voice come from? How do we know and recognize when we're speaking truthfully in our voices? Whose voices are heard and whose voices aren't heard? It's a complex thing that we need to tune into, to maybe at times to not speak, and to allow other people, or to help other people, inspire other people to articulate their voice. But this has to fit in with a social system, and our dominant, mainstream media system kind of doesn't really want us to acquire an independent voice. It's quite happy with us having a kind of imitative voice. Let's watch a clip from the hypernormalization video, which is I think it's still available on the BBC iPlayer, but a filmmaker, Adam Curtis, who does these amazing documentaries using acquired footage through news media to kind of put forward a questioning of the way in which the world is mediated to us, as opposed to what we might think of as a bit more of a critical view of what power is and how society operates.
Just like the sound over the mountain tops, you know I'll always come again. You know I love to spend my morning time like sunlight dancing on your skin. I've never gone so wrong as to tell you lies. What you've seen is what I've been. There is nothing I could hide from you. You see me better than I can.
Kissinger will be arriving here about an hour and a half from now.
I've got some more acid over here if you want to go ahead and drop it.
Politics, 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 politics. Don't politic, don't vote.
What the heck is that? Oh my god, look at that. It's just moving really slow.
Then this.
So there's a quote which I think is worth reading, and about what the film tries to do. It says it shows that what has happened to us all of us in the West, not just the politicians and the journalists and the experts, but we ourselves, have retreated into a simplified and often completely fake version of the world. But because it's all around us, we accept it as normal. It's quite a bleak idea, really, that kind of postmodern fatalism that you can't do anything about, the hyper-normalization of the world. It's all images, it's all spin, it's all marketing. And I'm kind of less inclined to be so fatalistic about it, because I think there is something we can do, and that is to find the voice within ourselves and the voice that connects us with other people, and the way in which we can express that voice is something which is incredibly powerful. And that idea of speaking our truths and speaking out and discussing our experiences, facilitating that deliberation, a David Bohm idea of deliberative engagement is really important. And hopefully it would be a counterbalance to the manipulative post-truth cynicism generating mass media approach. There is an alternative. and there are alternative outlets, and maybe these outlets, in the grand scheme of things, I wouldn't want to be uncritical about them, but we can now access other sources of information than the mainstream news organisations, but this is why we need a really strong investment in media literacies and this is something which happens in the Nordic countries, Sweden and Finland, place a lot of time and energy in education, helping people to learn the skills, to define on the basis on which somebody is speaking a truth or the truth, what is verifiable information, what's the difference between opinion, how are people using the techniques of manipulation or the techniques of diversion, whatever it is, to encourage and engage in an accountable and sustainable way. So there's a big this leads into all the discussion that we have necessarily about fake news and politics and globalized media and marketing and things like that. So it's not without its challenges to think in this way, but we can only do this as individuals, and we can make our contribution through media such as we are doing now, and we can make our own media. And I think that's one of the crucial differences, that it's okay if you're if you're not satisfied with the current media environment, well, make your own. Come on, make your own. We have the resources, we have the skills, but then the question is, what are you going to say and how are you going to say it? So the question is, it's kind of, how are we regaining our voices as individuals, as groups? So we're not just allowing other people to speak for us on our behalf, but that we're not just accounted for by certain types of media professionals, but actually what we want to say and what we want to develop to be able to say, because we might not know what it is that we want to say at any one point, but we know that we need to articulate and learn what it is that we want to say. Having the space and using our media to engage in that kind of ongoing social learning, deliberation kind of process, I think is pretty important, and one of the key roles for community media, such as the cultural context in which this takes place, and thinking that we think about media, but we don't think about culture enough, and our conversation and discussion about culture is perhaps something that we need to pay more attention to. And because culture is seen as something, it's become debased in modern Western society, because it's something that you acquire easily and something which you can just order on Amazon. What demonstrates and shows that you're a cultured person, or you're a person with a culture or part of a shared culture. It's the multicultural model works to a point, but then you've got to ask the question, okay, you've brought all of these people together from different backgrounds and different traditions, with different histories and different informed by different cultural ideas. Now, what are you going to do with them? What happens as we move forward? How do we move forward in the future in a way which is socially inclusive and allows people to have a shared sense of expression, and doesn't devalue anybody's sense of expression? So it's a way of thinking about our culture as being something which is enunciated within a particular time and place, but also which has value as something which connects us, brings about a sense of belonging, and brings about a sense. Now, who decides what that culture is? Where are the decision? Do we need cultural gatekeepers to form an expression of our culture? Do we need this hierarchically arranged arts and media infrastructure to make decisions on our behalf? Or are we talking about a collapse of the hierarchy, in which case the danger is that we lose a sense of what is valuable within our culture, and everything becomes. Remember, I think in one of the maybe the first of these talks, the Russell Ackoff, the marketing guru, was describing, Shakespeare as just this guy from the Midlands in England, and Mozart as this funny little guy from Austria, and Leonardo da Vinci is, the Mona Lisa as a painting of a Venetian housewife. How much does that damage the reputation of our culture and the sense that there is value in those artistic creative expressions which people laboured over? He just sees it as a t-shirt that you can sell, or an icon that could be put on postcards or put on the sides of buses in order to market and sell products or promote the tourism industry. And I suppose a definition of our culture would be that which we would not want to give up under any circumstances, which is our shared sense of identity. That, if somebody took it away from us, or it stopped being available to us, that we would regard. So I think it just dropped out of the screen for a second then. I'll try and patch that so it doesn't feel as if it's dropped out too much. So the point was, our culture can be, how is our culture defined? Who defines what our culture is? How do we engage in our culture? How do we promote the values and virtues of our culture? How do we how do we minimize the negative, account for the negative aspects of our culture? And how is that a living expression of who we are and what we're about? It's fragile. As I say, it's fragile. Our culture in a way is something which, it's like the wind. It can be blown, it can come and go quite easily. It's fragile. It can dissipate. It can be negative in that it blows things over, or it can be positive in that it brings the warmth and renewal of the spring, if you like. Our culture is, it's the fragile. It's the word that kind of comes to mind is the zephyrs, the winds from the west that point us in the direction of renewal. And our culture is something which is to be celebrated in all of its forms as something which is inclusive and as many people as possible. But our culture isn't just shopping or just football or just cars or just Netflix programs. Our culture is something which amounts to something greater, one would hope. It can't be reduced to just elements of a commercialized model. So what we're thinking about then is, where do we fit as individuals, as citizens, within that cultural participation process or model, the dialogue, the debate, the deliberation, the perspectives that we bring, the way in which we participate and deal with other people who are also participating, and making things accessible, but at the same time protecting the value of those things as well, to simply reduce our culture to something which can be, as I say, just kind of handed out as postcards. It implies that there's no work that needs to be done in which to understand it. And there's always work that needs to be done. And understanding things that take place in the present day is incredibly difficult. It takes a lot of work. But we have more techniques and tools which we can question, and we can discuss models of culture, models of dialogue, models of debate, models of deliberation with other people. So the idea is, to build a common culture, we have to be active participants in that common culture. And so at what point does this kind of turn us into activists? As individuals wishing to express our voice, we may be going against the mainstream view, the majority view, and we may be putting ourselves on one side or the other of an argument. And what vehicles for expression do we have, and how do we see that that is a contribution to the level of debate, deliberation, and engagement for the social good? Or in its most negative terms, just a kind of how would you describe it? The self regard that sometimes comes with people being correct and right, because their views are purer than other people's views, and that isn't dialogue. That doesn't convince anybody. That doesn't bring anybody together to formulate a common proposal. What it can do at its worst is to polarize people and ensure that people don't come together to learn from one another. So the activist media can be about raising voices, but sometimes it's not about listening. So what do we want? Do we want a model of activism which is purely about shouting, or declaiming, or pointing out everybody else's faults? Or do we want to encourage dialogue and reflection and mutual understanding? And these aren't easy. As I say, it's easy to talk about this stuff in theory, but it's harder to do in practice. And when we're thinking about this, I think we stand a better chance of getting this right if we trust people, and we facilitate people, and we invest in the grassroots participation, because we're not, a culture that is organised from the top down. In many ways, that's what the BBC tries to do. Isn't success? It becomes unrooted, and we see that at the moment with the reforms that are being proposed, contentious reforms that are being proposed of the BBC, and one of the models and the arguments about the BBC media reform is to turn it into a grassroots-led organisation, maybe a cooperative. At the moment, it's an executive-led model, and I think that's to its detriment, because it doesn't have buy-in from people. It doesn't have people actively supporting, in a practical sense, what the investment brings and achieves, and a sense of common purpose. It's kind of, we're told, well, the BBC is good for you, therefore you should pay money to maintain it, but you don't really have a say in what's going on. And this is why I think community media is so much more important, that if we invest in that grassroots level of media engagement, then and encourage that sense of participation, and participation isn't something which is a magic wand. It doesn't just provide answers by itself. It has its problems as well. But it's a start in readdressing some of the one-sidedness of the present media landscape, if you like. So where does, at what point does getting involved in your local community radio station or community website or community Facebook group become something which is a kind of form of popular resistance? It's people doing things for themselves, mobilizing people that they associate with and like and agree and get on with and do things with. That provides a valuable resource. It might not be big P politics, and it might not be cutting edge aesthetic expression. It might not be, it might not attract. It might not attract the social magpies, if you like, who look for the shiny objects, but it does the everyday work, and it's incredibly valuable and incredibly important because it's kind of accessible. You don't need to be part of the elite. That's a bad word to use, but what I mean by that is you don't need to be part of a clique or a restricted group to be involved. Community media has this element to it with it's about its ordinariness. It's about its lack of professional capacity. It's about it being something which as many people as possible can be getting involved, and we're finding ways to encourage that, rather than it being something which is predetermined for people as a model of expression which is beyond them. It's got that sense of you can turn up at the door, find it accessible. You don't have to be trendy. You don't have to be media able. You don't have to be, you just be yourself. And that kind of finding that, that focus, and that's quite difficult to do because people are often pulled towards the shininess, the persona model of media. So the projection of something. So people think that media is a performance. People think it is about, and there's an element to this about presenting yourself in. So it's called, you go on a radio station and you're called a presenter. And I think that's kind of part of that language discourages participation, because you kind of want people to go on and just be themselves, a contributor. I prefer to use the phrase contributor or facilitator rather than presenter. I call it a program. I don't call it a show. Although, other people like this language and feel very comfortable with it. I kind of think we need to, and I don't think I question it enough in terms of that language. So, I try not now to use the word producer. I use the word maker. Because there's connotations that are associated with the kind of words that get, and a lot of people with community radio have learned through the commercial radio or the BBC radio model. And it's like kind of what you're trying to say to people is, no, you need to unlearn those models and you need to think in a different way, which is why we value the community development approach and the community engagement approach, because it's about turning this from a top down to a bottom up approach, and it's about building accessibility into this process whereby what you're saying and what you're doing brings people together to feel confident that they can participate in something that they would not in a million years feel as if they could take part in something. But when they identify with people like themselves, and when they identify with people of a similar social background, and the resources are made accessible to them in such a way that it doesn't put them off, it's not like you're walking into a radio studio that feels like the bridge of the Starship Enterprise and there's 10 million buttons that you could press and you only need one, turn the microphone on, point and talk into the microphone. And, it's kind of, what skills do you need? Well, you just need to be able to have a conversation with somebody, really. It's not about projecting yourself. It's not about building up a persona. There's a lot of fun to be had from that. Don't get me wrong. I'm not against it. But I think there's plenty of opportunities to follow that model of media engagement in other platforms and in other services. But in community media, it's about kind of helping people to find their own voice, as we've said many times, and to determine for ourselves what we value about our media engagement. So there's this idea of we're kind of being situated then as individuals or collective groups within a kind of, we live in a power dynamic. Those who can speak, those who can't speak, those who have access to resources, those who don't. And so within this process, I always like there's a Michel Foucault, I think he says, where there's power, there's resistance. And I've always thought that was a really good electronic engineering joke. But nobody ever seems to laugh at my jokes. But this idea of, where there is power, there is counterpower. Is that true? Is that something that we should be worried about? And how do we counterbalance, I think would be a better phrase, the unbalanced focus on corporate and mainstream models, professionalized models of media, and what would be the counterbalance to the dominant way of doing things? So the economic, the ideological, what is it that we kind of need to do to provide an alternative space to put ourselves in a position where we are feeling confident and entitled and sure that our voice is valuable, and other people of a similar intent, their voices are valuable, as opposed to simply trying to fit in with a strategic model which is decided through focus groups and economic planning and think tank policy development ideas. There's a civic entitlement, there's a democracy element to this, that we find our voice. But if we don't exercise our voice, if we don't practice speaking with others and listening to others and encouraging others to speak, then we won't get anywhere. And it can be very frustrating to live in a world where the debate seemed one-sided. But we rather than just moaning about it, I think what we've got to do is put it into practice, get out there and express ourselves and encourage other people to express themselves. And so what's different now? I mean, if you go back to the 70s and 80s, I suppose, before the information technology revolution, we had a kind of mass globalized world which was arising in the 70s and 80s, which wasn't open to people. Now, it's and this would be a good thing to do for an associated conversation, is really about how we can use these tools and technologies and techniques to kind of explore these alternative spaces. And I've written recently about YouTube and the rise of the walking tour video, and there's some examples of people I follow on YouTube who talk about their town and what's going on and their sense of belonging. And I think that's kind of an incredibly important counterweight to the kind of what one guy I follow, A Walk on the Wild Side, I mention him a lot now, is in Blackpool. And Blackpool ever only really gets covered in the news when there's a problem, and that there's a kind of a report comes out about deprivation and employment skills and things like that. Whereas for the people who live there, there are things that are actually matter. Walking along the high street and getting, almost getting pushed over by the wind, or kind of rubbish and litter being scattered about, or buildings in a decrepit state, or what does your council tax go on? Those kind of questions. Bringing it down to the grassroots level, but connecting the grassroots with the tools of production, of media production, not from an ideological perspective, but from a pragmatic, practical perspective, I think is kind of the space that we need to fill. And it takes a lot, because it's hard work to help people acquire and use the skills of communication in order to be able to fill those kind of gaps without doing the kind of the flag waving, if you like, and the slogan chanting. But it's essential for an active sense of democracy, and the idea that we are part of a world which relies on independent thinking and independent news and independent media, and that if we lose access to trusted and viable independent media, then we lose our citizenship. Our human rights become devalued, and we become merely subject to the whims of the powerful, who don't want these things to be talked about and discussed. So community media has this role of deliberation, and it's essential for bringing people together for the purpose of a functioning social democracy, where we can think about and shape our collective future in conversation, not necessarily, kind of sloganizing with one another. I mean, we've mentioned, and we will look at this again in a second, but this kind of sense of engagement can be faked, for want of a better phrase. But what is it that, if we've got our independent voices and we're articulating those voices, not in a way that, is antagonistic or polarizing or designed to shock for the sake of shocking, but is actually, being interested in asking the questions of, what matters in our community, and how do we decide what matters in our community and who gets to speak in our community. And it's always, the rule of thumb with this, it's the voice that isn't in the room, the voice that isn't being heard, the people who are being overlooked. Well, we need to find ways to include people who would otherwise be overlooked in the conversations. And so part of this is about the kind of the deprofessionalization of our media. We've talked about this previously. So that both the kind of media content is deprofessionalized and the decision-making process that supports the development of that content is deprofessionalized, but also the kind of the environment is changed. And I there's some examples of this. Of Melodic Distraction in Liverpool is one of my favourite stations, and what they've done with the station, the online radio station that they produce, is just really kind of great because it's accessible and it feels it's completely different from commercial radio stations, and it has hundreds of volunteers wanting to take part and support the station because they feel that they belong to it. Sound Art Radio down in Totnes in Devon, again, it's not about having a swanky screen-based studio. It's about providing a space in which people feel comfortable to be themselves and to engage with one another and to relax and feel as if, I love the idea, the kind of sofa focus is that you don't need desks. You just need to be able for people to be comfortable and to be able to hear one another. And to put microphones in the space, so we had to deprofessionalize and to make media accessible. We also have to change the structure of the way that the environment that we build, which would support it. So we can't just have the same, kind of platforms. The same kind of professional spaces which are designed to do a specific job in one instance, but to enable ordinary people to come in and feel comfortable about sharing their voice, we need very different spaces from which to develop community media. And one of the other challenges, I think, is participation. Is there's a kind of focus about outcomes in social policy development, and I think that's a problem because we don't know what the outcomes might be from our engagement. We have to learn from what we do as we go along, and we have to think about how changes are informed and how changes are reconstituted as we go along. So this is kind of a model of action research type thinking, which doesn't see the inputs and the outputs of a process as being, what you put in is what you're going to get out. You've got to be open to getting something completely unexpected. You've got to be attuned to a way of doing things which generates. And I tend to think of this as about, rather than outcomes thinking, I think in terms of values, because once I start to address, or once I start to engage with other people on the basis of the values, the things that they value, then there's this outpouring of content rather than the other way around. If I said to you, I want to see an outpouring of content, and with no understanding of what motivates people to produce those outcomes, you're never gonna do that. You're never gonna complete that circle. All you're gonna do is annoy people because you're placing something which is not driven by their values. Grounding. Let's grind it. Grounding community media in people's values. All of a sudden, it opens up. What do people care about and what do people care for? Become primary ideas that we can engage with people on that basis, rather than just thinking, well, what is the outcome? How can we measure this? And this takes us to a model of engagement and participation, which is about citizenship and being a citizen within it's hard being a citizen. You don't have easy access to resources and answers, and power is necessarily separate and distant from citizens. And sometimes all you've got left is to resort to protest in order to make your point and bring about change. Well, I'm not saying that community media should be a vehicle for protest, but it should be a vehicle for people's concerns. And if managed and facilitated properly in a deliberative way, then some of the things that, how do we end up in a position where we end up with protests? It's because we've not enabled people to talk about things prior to these to these events, because we haven't got a shared culture of exchanging of ideas and concepts, because we're disassociated from our mainstream media, and we're not seeing the change that we want to see in society, whatever your point of view about that is. But pull it back, a more deliberative, citizen-focused form of media. The challenge is Ofcom, the media regulator. I think it focuses far too much on the rights of the consumer, the interests of the consumer, and it doesn't do enough of it meeting its obligations to meet the rights of the citizen. And part of the rights of being a citizen, I pay my taxes, I vote, I have a voice, and it is legitimate that voice is heard equally in relation to others. So we're not just the subject of patronage. We're not just the subject of, being bought off, or we're not just shut down because people don't agree with us. The expression of citizenship sometimes comes through in terms of protest, but having that culture within our media of citizens' engagement is something we've just not invested in here in the UK, and we really need to be building models of engagement, because the danger is, and we've seen this model before, is Sherry Arnstein's model of participation. That it's at what point do citizens have control, and at what point are citizens just being manipulated? The measurable expression of participation, well, participation doesn't do anything in itself. It's a neutral process. It does indicate to us that the more people are participating in something, the more likely they are to have some delegated power or some control. So they move away from the kind of tokenistic gestures of consultation and being informed to something which is more about a kind of co-creation, co-development. And this is something that fits with the citizenship model of social theory that is informing a lot of our need to reevaluate our democratic capacity. The danger is that these models of management and governance can become empty rituals. And I've always said that if you work for an organisation that say you said we did, that's not a participatory, consultative, co-producing organisation. It's the manager's office door is always open, but you've got to get past 5 secretaries and 3 assistants, and 50% of the year is spent with the manager being away in business trips, and and yet you're still somehow expected to understand what an organisation wants from you. So we've got to be really careful about, kind of the executive business management culture is anathema to participation and engagement and work-based democracy. And I think there's enough evidence to suggest that our productivity is suffering because we have this kind of autocratic, hierarchical models of management which adopt the rituals of public engagement, but don't know how to put them into practice. And we need to test these things. And so I think the role of community media is to be part of a process which expresses different points of views, because we can be easily led. And at what point are these views critically tested, and who has the power and who can make the assumptions, and who is somebody speaking for, is who are the vested interests, who are the private subgroups that nobody knows about, where are the secret decisions being taken. And as a democracy, this has to be opened up. I think for a successful democracy, decision making also has to be recorded and shared. I think one of the I must get a copy of the video, a link to the video, but the discussion at the beginning of the lockdown, and there was a debate about a local council, and there was a temporary Jackie, I can't remember her surname. She was the clerk for the evening, and she shut down the meeting because the behaviour of the chair and various people on this, just a parish council meeting, it was done over Zoom. It went viral, and I think transparency is a good thing. Seeing how some of our decision-making bodies operate, and how people behave, and what the way they present themselves, being able to capture that and share that is essential. And I think that should be, local authorities have to provide the content to their local community media organisations and put these things out there in a way which facilitates engagements and gets people interested in, how this is run and how things are decisions are made and who's making them. And the more transparent it is, the better. But it's shine a light on it, is my view. But you've also got to think about who the mediators are and who is undertaking the work and for what reason. And we've seen a kind of 10-year period really here in the UK, if not longer, of the things catching up with the closure of the News of the World because of the privacy investigations that were kind of being found against them, and things like supposed journalists being imprisoned because of their rather underhand dealings for telling stories. So people are very distrustful of mass mainstream media because it's not been led in an inclusive way. It's not been managed in an inclusive way. It's not held accountable by government. So when it makes mistakes, when things are not run correctly, when things are run in the interest of, the corporate interest, but not the public interest, then people are skeptical about what can be done. And again, I kind of come back to the idea, well, if you want a better media, you have to make it yourself. So if you're not happy with what the choices are that are available to you, you either have to pay or get engaged with promoting an alternative platform to that. So volunteer for your local community newspaper or community radio station. Don't just think that you can only be a consumer. But put that in the context of, if you like, the shifting ground. The idea that, kind of people's trust in media is shifting because of the introduction of so many other platforms. The measurement of trust is quite interesting in terms of the vast range. We used to think of television news, radio news, newspapers, but now we also add online networks, online blogs, online social network platforms, and where they rank within the level of trust with people is kind of, requires a massive investment to maintain levels of trust. And as we enter into a world of decentralized media consumption with things like the introduction of blockchain, then we still need to invest in institutions to provide the basis on which trust is understood. But if you look at things like media, the number of people reading newspapers on a daily basis has plummeted. The kind of activities by age group of who watches TV, live TV, who watches on-demand media, these are all changing and shifting. So they present new challenges for the way that we think about the media landscape within which community media fits. And the deprofessionalization model, I think, is vital. Therefore, in terms of the regard that community media is something that you can get involved in and that you can take part in, and that you have access to a platform which you manage yourself, or you're part of a group or team who manage it, and that you are able to develop skills, develop experience, and develop ideas about what nurtures a sense of community, as opposed to what merely presents information to a community. It's not an easy task. And we have to think about what the barriers to expression are for people and as individuals and groups, and the function of, if you like, for participatory media skills and literacy and understanding. Unfortunately, again, in the UK, the media studies model is devalued. It's pretty much been written out of schools, just at the point when it's incredibly important that you need to understand how to do things like collaborative editing, messaging, bookmarkings, when something's syndicated, the skills that are involved, but the literacies and understanding and the values that drive our media. It's more important than ever that we're building opportunities for people to participate on an informed basis, and to participate on the basis that that everybody has enough skills to have their contribution recognized. And some people need support in doing that. Some people become proficient quite quickly, and some people may never be very proficient, but that doesn't mean to say that we should deny that anybody the opportunity to have their voice heard and their stories told, because it's an essential part of a functioning democracy. So one of the models that is always worth looking at and revisiting is the community media cafe model, which is something that John Costa developed. This is a few years old. I think it's 2015 or something like that. And with Citizens Eye, it's still worth sharing. I mean, the just a short piece of video, not expertly recorded. You do what you can, and you get it out there, and that's still available on YouTube even now. And I think it's important that we kind of have to roll our sleeves up and get on with it. So Henry Jenkins, who's a media theorist, talks about this in terms of what defines a participatory culture, and I'm not. I think we can go further than this, but I think it's a good starting point in terms of, keep the barriers low about what your artistic, creative expression or civic engagement is going to be. Develop as much support you can for sharing and creating. And everyone who participates has to come away with a sense that their contribution matters. Whatever we think of that privately, and whatever our experience tells us, the contribution is, everybody's contribution is valuable. because that's where once people feel valued, then they're able to build social connections. And then don't do it through formal teaching, formal models of learning, formal models of qualifications and all that kind of stuff. It puts people off. I'm think about it in an informal sense, and don't get wrapped up in what the tools could be used like. The easiest way to depress yourself is to look at people on YouTube about the amazing videos that people produce with drones and focus pulls, and they're getting up before dawn to shoot shots. That, you know what, you've just got to do what you can do. Go for a walk, get out and about with your camera or your microphone or your pen and your notebook, and record, capture what you can. And if it's grainy, if it's poorly lit, if the sound is only just legible, who cares? Share it with people. You can always get better. It's not about it. Perfection culture is the anathema to a participation culture. So fitting this in with a kind of broader sense of politics is we could talk entirely for many hours about this in different ways, and no doubt we will do in future discussions and talks. But I think I like, I'm drawn to people like Václav Havel, the former Czech Republic president, who kind of says, it's the rules of everydayness. We have to start from the bottom and build up, because if we think that we can start from the top and build down, well, the foundations aren't in place, and we're building on top of people, and people are not building for themselves. So it's important and essential that we are mindful that the sense of self-identity and self-expression that we're supporting and facilitating comes from a place which is on solid foundations, I think. Okay. So the notes will be available for this talk. I will follow up with additional material as we go along. And if you've got any comments or thoughts, as ever, we've got the Decentered Media Forum, or Twitter and Instagram and email and everything else. But you'll get the details where you get access to the talk. That's it. So I'll speak to you soon. You've been watching a Decentered Media talk with me, Rob Watson. To find out more, go to decentered.co.uk or follow on Twitter and Instagram @Decentered Media.